Lucky Dube was not the first person to use reggae music on the continent of Africa. I'll talk about some others in a little while, particularly someone named Sonny Okosun, who died a few months after Lucky Dube was shot. Right. But Lucky Dube's music was really the most successful nativizing of reggae at that point. He was certainly the first to capture the ears and the respect of Jamaican musicians, Jamaican promoters, and Jamaican fans of reggae music. He definitely was the first to get that kind of attention outside of South Africa, outside of the continent. But he never really escaped the sense that to Jamaicans, his reggae was exotic, right? It was exotic, not something that you could take too seriously, right? I mean, of course, if you're a Jamaican Rasta roots reggae musician, and you hear of an African roots reggae musician, you're not going to criticize him, of course. I mean, he's really African, you know? But they really never, Lucky Dube never quite got the kind of respect that he probably deserved just on the basis of his music, right? He was exotic to Jamaican listeners, but very few musicians, African reggae musicians of his generation, very few of them could really escape this, but the irony was they were sheltered from having to worry about it because the primary audience for them were white, right? That's global white reggae audiences. They loved Lucky Dube, but the funny thing is he was being evaluated as an African by a different standard. For white listeners of reggae music, an African Rastafarian was really powerfully authentic. For Jamaican reggae musicians and music lovers, a non-Jamaican Rastafarian was exotic, right? So in many ways he suffered because for one group he was too African, for another group he wasn't African enough, right? And that was part of the difficulty for him and his generation. But the fact that his fan base outside of Africa was not so much West Indian or even African, certainly not African American, right? It was white. This is also, we know, the primary fan base and the most important, I think, motivating structure for reggae music, outside roots reggae music, has always been the white audience, right? But his global popularity, it really emerged not just during the death throes of apartheid, right? Another important thing, musically speaking, was that his popularity began to rise just at the moment when roots reggae seemed on the decline in Jamaica, right? And those of you who really know reggae music, I'm not talking about the new roots or the neo-roots stuff that's coming out. I'm talking about this older period when it seemed like roots reggae music was dead, right, or was dying, right? So he came up at that time along with other West African and particularly Nigerian reggae musicians, because at that time roots seemed to be going down, and most people outside of Jamaica, white, black, certainly African audiences, they hated dancehall music, right? And I think many of you are old enough to remember the period when dancehall began to be popular, right? Most of you in this room, if you love reggae, you must admit, for that short period of time, you hated dancehall music, right? I would admit it. And I run a sound system, you know? I hated dancehall music, right? It didn't sound like Africa. It was computerized, you know? So a lot of people were very hostile to the digital dancehall that came up after Bob Marley's death. So central to Lucky Dube's importance, whether you know his music or not, central to his significance was that he helped internationalize roots reggae as a real African just when people were listening to dancehall or raga and seeing in raga music an island, Jamaica, abandoning its politics. People heard dancehall music as Jamaica giving up on Africa, right? And as the music became more digital, people thought, well, what we're hearing is not roots, it's not Africa, it's not love, it's not revolution. What we're hearing is the sound of an accelerated and increasingly violent capitalism. That's what people heard in dancehall. Now, that's changed. A lot of people now in Africa and the world have integrated dancehall and digital reggae in lots of different ways. But during this period for Africans, dancehall was heard by the white audience and the African audience for reggae as dangerously inauthentic. Right? That's why when dancehall blew up internationally, there was so much controversy. right? I remember the days when people found out that Shabba Ranks, remember Shabba? Shabba Ranks outsold Bob Marley. When that happened in the United States, almost every Jamaican was in tears. I hear people now getting upset to find out how big Sean Paul is, right? You know, so what was heard was the politics of Africa, nationalism, racial pride was gone. All we heard was Punani, capitalism, violence, right? And I think a lot of people also lamented that herb was declining and cocaine was coming up, right? So dancehall people thought was not an open music. It wasn't an open music, right? It was too much about the borderline, right? Not about utopia, right? Also, back to a sort of a minor musical but major important issue with the music. At that time, the music, the production of reggae music shifted. So when you listen to reggae at that time, particularly when dancehall came, you didn't hear echoes, right? You didn't hear echoes. Dub and roots reggae is really characterized, at least in that generation, by echoes. And why is echo important? The echo chamber and the use of echo in reggae music was, I think, the central aspect of its politics. You could say Africa all you want, but when you can hear echoes, that created the illusion of space, right? Openness, space. And so when dancehall came out, there was no real space. It was in your face, you know? Powerful, aggressive, male, very masculine, you know? So the generation of dub roots production techniques changed. And so when you heard dancehall, you didn't hear something that welcomed you, especially with the language. Dancehall, they didn't want you to understand what they were saying unless you were from Tivoli, right? Or from Kingston. If you didn't understand it, they did not want you there. Roots reggae was inclusive, right? That's why we all love roots reggae, even if you're not Jamaican or even black. You love roots reggae because the music felt like you were welcome in it. Agree? You were welcome in it through space, through openness. Dancehall didn't want your presence. It was really rebelling against reggae's inclusion, right? Roots reggae's inclusion, at least at the time. People heard dancehall, they didn't hear Africa, space, distance. They heard something sharp, crisp, and closed, right? Now, Lucky Dube, many people say that his imitation of Jamaican reggae music and Rastafari thinking, it never made the transformation from a heartfelt and sincere imitation to the full flowering of something truly unique, you know? Keep in mind that the first sign of anything happening is imitation, right? It's easy to dismiss him as someone who was just imitating reggae, but the truth is, reggae was imitating lots of people, right? All art forms emerge primarily from imitation, and imitation is almost always cross-cultural. One culture imitates another, creates its own thing, and then tells people, you can't imitate me. That's, the moment you know you've created something is when you deny it to other people. That's pretty good, I like that. So people say that Lucky Dube never really made that change in the way that, let's say, ska music did when ska emerges out of Jamaican boogie-woogie and R&B, right? In the same way that the pre-ska music of Bob Marley and the Wailers, right? Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, Bunny Wailer. We know that the early days, those of you who may not know this, go on the internet, you need to see the early pictures of Bob Marley and the Wailers before dreadlocks, when they were in suits, for God's sakes. You know? Very important. I love that period. I love that period. I love that style. They were mods. You know mods? They were mods. Right?